Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to a webinar to discuss plastic contamination in our oceans. Uh, this is Ajay Gupta, host for the show. And I'd also like to let everyone know this is the first webinar that HSR.health is hosting. Talk about our wow, we're getting feedback. Paul, can you do something about that, or should I just log out of that? Just log out of that. Yeah, so this is the first webinar that HSR.health is hosting, and so technical delays like that or glitches that were unexpected are going to happen because we're going to make a bunch of rookie mistakes. But we're really excited to be here and to have a wonderful collection of expert guests from broad sets of industry to talk about this topic, and we will just dive right into it right now. So again, formally, thank you and good afternoon or good morning, good evening to wherever you are. Welcome to today's webinar, Raising Awareness and Saving Our Seas. We're delighted to have you join us as we dive into the critical issue of plastic pollution in our oceans and explore the impact that pollution has on both marine ecosystems and human health. And we will discuss also approaches and technologies that are helping us tackle it head on. Today, we're here not just because plastic pollution is an environmental problem, but because it's also a public health crisis. In fact, it's becoming more and more recognized that there are substantial health-related complications to exposure to plastics. It is also an economic drain and an issue that ultimately will affect each and every one of us in every continent of the planet. Every year, according to the Ocean Conservancy, over 11 million metric tons of plastic waste wind up in our oceans, endangering marine ecosystems, polluting our water sources, and harming sea life. And from there, finding their way into our foods, into the seafoods that we consume. Our oceans, often thought of as resilient and infinite. I mean, if you stand at the beach and look out at the ocean, how can you not help but feel and recognize the magnitude of these bodies of waters? However, they are showing signs of strain. And given that strain, it's important to remember that all of nature, sea life, human life, all of our livelihoods, and the health of the planet itself are deeply connected. At HSR.health, we've developed the Poseidon Plastic Tracking System, a platform that uses cutting-edge satellite imagery, geospatial mapping and visualization, artificial intelligence, and synthetic data to map and predict plastic pollution patterns. We'll talk about that in a little detail in a little while. With support from partners like NOAA and Natural Resources Canada, who both have representatives on the webinar today, Poseidon has been developed and demonstrated in the Fox River Basin of the Canadian Arctic, and we are now amidst expanding it globally. But what's truly powerful about Poseidon is its ability to move us from awareness to action, enabling local and global stakeholders to identify high-risk zones and to surveil for potential health impacts on the communities that are most at risk, as well as to help target, to the extent possible, to the extent practical, cleanup efforts with precision. Our goal for today's discussion is to share insights from leaders across various fields, as I mentioned, oceanography, technology, public health, and environmental sciences, and explore how collaborative efforts and new technologies can help us forge a path towards healthier oceans and resilient communities. Together, we can harness the power of data, technology, and the spirit of human collaboration to address one of the defining environmental challenges of our time. So let's get started, and thank you again for being part of this critical conversation. I think at this time, I'll just introduce everybody that's on the call or the webinar and give you a chance to sort of introduce yourselves as well. I'll go just sort of left to right from my screen, starting with Ryan Ahola, Environmental Scientist for Natural Resources Canada. Ryan, welcome to the webinar.
Great, thank you very much, AJ. So yes, I'm Ryan Ahola, based in Natural Resources Canada, which, if you're not familiar, is a department of Canada's federal government. Mostly, I work with an organization called the Open Geospatial Consortium, or OGC, which focuses on interoperability of geospatial information. So essentially making geographic data easier to find, access, share, and use. And it is in that context in which we were working with HSR.health within the Arctic Focus project that AJ mentioned earlier, that led to the prototype development of the system that will be described later on. So I'll certainly be happy to provide just perspectives on the work that we have done on interoperability and how the importance of that as this approach moves forward. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We are delighted that you're with us. As I mentioned, Natural Resources Canada and NOAA provided the seed funding to get this off the ground. And speaking of NOAA, we are really honored to be joined by Angelica Gutierrez. If I introduced her fully, it would take the rest of the hour. So let me just say lead scientist for NOAA, as well as co-chair for AmeriGeo, which is the America's version of the Group on Earth Observation, and co-chair for GeoGlows. Angelica, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Ajay. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I am Angelica Gutierrez. I am with the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service, NESDIS from NOAA. I lead activities under the Group on Earth Observation for the Americas. And today I will be talking about an effort that we initiated actually last year during AmeriGeo Week in Costa Rica, where we invited several of our partners in the region to talk about actually the issue of plastic pollution, not only in the ocean, but also in rivers. So I will be sharing today some of that information that we have been collecting since last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. And I'm glad that you brought that up, right? Because the issue of plastics in our oceans is certainly central to what we want to talk about today. But the oceans are not the only place we have plastics. And the oceans are not, it's not that the plastic necessarily jumps right into the ocean. So understanding the plastic sources of contamination and how they reach the deep ocean, which often can be through rivers, is itself very important. And I understand also that water on the planet is part of the water cycle, which we all learned hopefully in grade school, had some exposure to the water cycle, which means that some of the water evaporates and falls back down as rain. And we're seeing plastic rain or plastic in rain now, which not just recontaminates rivers, but also the land, the arable land and soil near rivers, which runs off into the rivers and therefore the ocean. So I'm looking forward to your comments and conversations on how we can take some of what we want to do in terms of tracking contamination in the oceans upstream into the rivers. And to next, Rich Fraser is with the Federal Geographic Data Committee, and is also someone who has been supportive of these efforts from the beginning and plays a big role with the OGC as well. Rich, welcome to the webinar.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and also just want to express my sincere thanks to you, Ajay, and Paul, and the rest of the team for all of your hard work to help promote the use of spatial data and bringing that together very closely with health data. I think we all know from the recent pandemic and a variety of other similar related activities that are going on around the world, this is a very important subject, and I'm very excited to see the results from the recent pilots, which, like my colleague Ryan, we also support very closely from the USGS and the Federal Geographic Data Committee.
Cool. And thank you and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And next, Antonio Correas. Antonio Correas is a co-founder and chief product officer for Skymantics, a technology firm in the geospatial space that who's joining us to talk about the uses of synthetic data in predictive analytics. Welcome, Antonio.
Thank you, Ajay. So Antonio Correas here. I'm very happy to be here in the first webinar that you guys are organizing, Ajay. So I'm very honored to be here. So we are a small business. We work mostly for U.S. government, but not only. And our specialty is data generation for testing, for AI algorithm training. And we have recently be working in a product that is a generator of synthetic data sets that can be used for a certain number of use cases to forecast the population into the future for health emergencies, for disaster management, or for insurance planning. So I'll be very happy to talk about that in more detail in a moment. Thanks.
Cool. And the next person you might be seeing on the screen is Paul Churchard. Paul Churchard is the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Geospatial Officer for HSR.health, our firm, who is also the individual that came up sort of with the idea for Poseidon.
Yeah, thank you very
So
much, Ajay. Hello, everyone.
Go ahead.
No, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Churchard. As Ajay mentioned, I've been at HSR for about 5.5 years now, and I'm really excited to discuss with everyone today and kind of show the work we've done so far and where we're going with plastics and health. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I really want to get your thoughts, Paul, on where you came up with the idea to build this system. So just as basic background, although I do believe that many people on the call will already know that plastics have been discovered almost anywhere we look for them. All the oceans and all the continents, even Antarctica, has some level of plastic contamination in its ecosystems. We're also learning now that microplastics, which is just small pieces of plastic, also are fairly ubiquitous. And even nanoplastics, plastic pieces down to the nanoscale, have been found in lots of places. Essentially, what happens is plastic, like other organic or materials, breaks down over time. And it breaks down, it doesn't disintegrate. It really breaks into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So when you have a piece of plastic that's become trash, eventually it'll become a lot of pieces of microplastic. And then it'll become a lot of pieces, very broad disbursement of nanoplastics, right? And these smaller pieces, they accumulate, they build up, and they can penetrate the defenses that we have against larger items. They can get into our cells, they can get into tissue, and they can cause a number of problems from just simply inflammation of itself, but the toxins and chemicals that are used to construct plastic can leach into our bodies and cause problems. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to ask you, Paul, where did you get the idea for developing a solution to track plastics and then assess the health level, the health impacts from those plastics?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jay. So I had previous knowledge of some of the issues surrounding plastic pollution, and I think a lot of people have heard about like the Pacific garbage patch, right? So there is some mainstream knowledge of the general issue of plastic in our oceans, and during my undergrad, I did have some exposure to information surrounding microplastics and some of the potential health impacts of that. And then when we had the ability and the opportunity to develop a solution that brought together data from land and sea, I thought that identifying the health impacts from plastic contamination would be a perfect fit.
Cool. So what was the process then, right? Where did you start from with doing this?
So I performed research into sorry, I'm trying to share my screen, but it's being difficult. Okay, there we go. Thanks. Sorry for your patience. Thank you for your patience. So we performed research into the health risks from plastic bioaccumulation and developed a health risk index based on that research. Additionally, we performed research into the sources and types of plastic contamination, along with utilizing a plastic detection map algebra function from Sentinel Hub to extract plastic presence and quantity in surface waters, both of which are shown here on screen for the Fox River Basin in the Canadian Arctic as a part of the pilot process that we engaged in that was funded by NOAA and Natural Resources Canada.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And what was the role that you felt NOAA and NRCan, Natural Resources Canada, played in that? Were they helpful in ideation? Was it data streams that we needed? Where did the data to track the plastics come from?
Yeah, thank you. So the data to track the plastics came from mainly Sentinel-2. And as I mentioned, we got the detection algorithm from Sentinel Hub. And Natural Resources Canada played a good role in identifying a region of interest to them, so that what we produced would be of demonstrable value to them, to kind of show the concept, show how decisions could be made, and so that it can be brought forward to other decision makers to show the value of these sorts of analytics and insights.
Cool. So then what we have then, as you showed a second ago, it's on screen, is the ability to use satellite data to identify a part of the ocean and the quantity and volume of plastics in the ocean. Angelica, I'd like to go to you to talk now about what we hinted on, that we also need to track it where the plastic is from those locations to its source and to its essentially the final destination, sort of the ecosystems where it is having an impact. Can you talk about the mechanism that you have in place to track plastics in rivers and upstream locations?
So we have been exploring, so I lead the Global Water Sustainability Initiative, GeoClose, and the purpose of that project is to provide hydrological forecasting worldwide. We have 7 million rivers where we are doing that. And so NOAA was actually also exploring, for NOAA and for the US actually, and for the Americas, it's very important, the pollution that we see in our coast, in our rivers and so forth. So the idea was, how can we connect the fact that we have a global forecasting, to the possibility of detecting plastic contamination. And so the lead in the side of plastic was one of my colleagues, David Street, also from NESDES. And so we have been trying to see how this came across. And that's when we put together, as I mentioned last year, a group of experts from the Americas region. We had participants from Guatemala, from Costa Rica, also the United States and other countries, Canada. So the first thing that we actually started looking into it was, what is the current status of laws? Can we start not only from the technical perspective of trying to figure out how to use a forecast, but also from the law perspective, what do we have in the region? And it was really interesting because we found that 27 countries of the 33 countries in Latin America have already passed either national or local laws to reduce or prohibit or eliminating single use of plastics, for example, one of the most contaminant products. So, and if we go through the different countries, Antigua and Barbuda was the first country that implemented law in 2016, followed by Argentina and so forth. And so we have the regulations there. One of the interesting pieces that actually kept my attention was listening to Guatemala and Costa Rica, who are actually now looking into what they call the extended producer responsibility laws. So it is just interesting how the different governments are actually aware of this. So in terms of the technical piece to track plastic through from rivers to the ocean is in the development, but the pieces of that puzzle are there. Now is to work with those countries who already have laws and programs in place to really implement or put concrete examples of that. So it is in progress, but we are working towards that.
Yes, and I think there may be something that we, as the technology community, can do to help with that. So Rich and Ryan, feel free to jump in on this point, but I think part of the reason, Angelica, you are working with countries that have laws in place, and that you're finding that as a process. Maybe because the consequences of plastic contamination are sort of long-term, right? So you don't necessarily see, even though you can see a piece of plastic debris right here, right now, you can pick it up, throw it away or whatever, but the consequences are not necessarily right in front of us, and therefore it can be hard to get people to act about a long-term problem. But that's sort of where we can come in, where Antonio with some synthetic data with a system like Poseidon can come in and make it very clear what the complications in today and into the future can be from exposure to contaminated waters or exposure to fish that have consumed a great deal of plastic in their systems. This kind of visibility into the problems in the near term can certainly help all governments who, as you said, Angelica, have some degree of awareness. Clearly, they know that large amounts of plastic are produced every year, and that of that plastic that's produced, a substantial portion from production all the way to waste are disposed of into the oceans, or do reach our ecosystems. So producing a mechanism that indicates what the harm is, health and ecosystem harm is something that we can do. So let me turn to Antonio, and just simply to talk about, if you'd like, how do we use, what is the role of synthetic data in projecting into the future what the consequences could be for plastic consumption?
Exactly right. Yeah. Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, I think in a few words, what synthetic data can do, or a synthetic digital twin, is that it can address this aspect that is often disregarded when you assess the long-term impact of polluting elements on population's health. And this is that population communities are dynamic environments. They are not static. They change with time. And there can be many different ways that a population and a community can change into the future. So I will talk a little bit about the technology that we are using in partnership with HSR.health to cope with this challenge and to be able to quantify strategically in the long term health impacts more accurately and more precisely. So we talked about plastic contamination in water bodies, and because this is a health crisis, right? We want to assess the impact to the health of the affected population, right? People living in coastal cities or cities that are in near water bodies. So especially those communities that are in higher risk because of the demographic or socioeconomic vulnerability, we want to assess that impact. And that is actually possible to do today with public data. The limitation with today's population data is that it's static. So you can use it to produce a picture of today, but you cannot use it to assess changes in the environment in the future. Basically, there is no data from census or from CDC or from other sources that will tell you what certain vulnerable communities will look like in the near future after a major health shock happens, such as, for instance, an epidemic. So we need models, we need time series models of populations with demographic and socioeconomic and geographic baselines together with health conditions, how they behave in a disaster, in a pandemic, or in a health emergency, and what patterns of growth and migration are also compounded into the population. Otherwise, the analysis that we do on the impact in the population health will remain a static picture and will get outdated very, very, very soon. So the basic tool that is used for simulating and assessing a known environment is this would be a digital twin, which is an accurate representation of the reality that allows you to analyze inputs and outputs. Like, for instance, if there is a certain amount of microplastics in the drinking water, you can get an amount of incidence of certain types of cancer, for instance. But that's still limited to today's environment, to the real environment that is known today. A digital twin is unable to change and to evolve into a new environment that could be produced by, let's say, a pandemic, migration driven by climate change, or an economic recession. So this is why we are working on an emerging concept, which is an evolution of the digital twin, which is called the synthetic digital twin. So we use a combination of different types of artificial intelligence algorithms that are based on authoritative data sources to learn about events that happen to population communities at the micro level, at the individual level, the household level, so that we can recreate chains of events and reproduce a particular population status into a future scenario. And this is what is called synthetic data. It's data that is not real, but is realistic and is accurate according to reality. And the big advantages of synthetic data is that it has no sensitive, no private information, so it's really free to share. And also, it can inform models and create variations of it, sort of a game of the Sims game that you have all probably played at some moment in your lives. So, for instance, a population in a certain area could be expected to grow older, while, for instance, the air quality is degrading, for instance, due to a concentration of microplastics in the air. So we should be able to generate that future status of the population and the new vulnerabilities and the location of those vulnerabilities. So I do think that this new concept is a game changer for planning and for thinking strategically in health policy, and assigning the right resources, because it allows decision makers to think more strategically, to lay out alternative scenarios of the future and see how certain policies, certain actions would affect the population, not of today, but several years in the future when such actions will see an effect. And we have started to pilot this technology together with our partners at the HSR.health in the Open Geospatial Consortium. This is a pilot 2023. We simulated evacuations to wildfires that allow to assess the priority of evacuation of different communities. And now, right now, we just finished the first version of our population aging and forecasting models. So they work very well, I have to say. So we are able to take a population of today and forecast it years into the future. So I'm really looking forward to putting that into practice into a health planning initiative. So thanks, Ajay.
Yeah, so are we. We're really looking forward to that, Paul. And I want to ask you, with this synthetic data, do you anticipate being able to assess the potential health complications and the communities that will bear those complications due to the levels of plastic contamination in our oceans in 5 or 10 years into the future?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because, yeah.
Sorry, Antonio.
Is that
one word answer? That's perfectly fine, gentlemen. Right. The answer is yes. We can predict health complications and the communities that suffer those complications into the future based on assessing and aging today's census data. So certainly, Angelica, I want to throw that back to you. Is that something that you might find helpful in your efforts, in your relationships and dealings with governments to get motion, to get action?
Definitely, the issue is always the acquisition capacity, right? So when someone talks to me about new technology, the first thing that comes to my mind is how much does it cost? Because, we are not, when you go to countries, and I'm talking about, developing countries everywhere, and you say to an organization, let's say a space agency, what is your annual budget per year? And they come and they say, well, it's $500,000. Right away, you know that whatever technology you are going to bring into the country, it's going to have to be affordable. So I think that would be my point. Make sure that any technology that is being developed, new sensors and so forth, that the countries can really afford that technology, because otherwise it will be better not to have the latest technology, but to have something that the countries can afford and actually use. So technology, yes, of course it is useful, but it's the cost of that technology, which is always a problem.
Yeah, I think that is certainly true, and we recognize that, right? When we build the technology, we recognize the cost implications. I think the question that I was asking is a little bit different, although we definitely want to talk before the end of the hour, Angelica, on the overall costs. But what I'm suggesting is, and Rich would love your thoughts on this. I know you are very interested in the conversations around what is authoritative data. This is the process of creating visualizations. So essentially creating information on what the health risks are due to plastic contamination in this case, but it could be of any reason. But we can estimate based on today's authoritative data that we have taken through a synthetic aging process and estimate the health implications in 5 years and 10 years. Let's consider that visualization or a report that we could produce. With that, two-part question. First part, Rich, maybe to you. Would you still consider that authoritative data or based on authoritative data after a synthetic aging process on authoritative census data? And then would such report, no cost, no technology, no issue of that, but just the report of potential health implications of plastic contamination year 5, year 10, would that be something that the world might find of use, of value?
So I think that that's a really difficult question to answer. Of course, with modeling and simulation, when you're using those methods, there is a lot of potential variability, and also, as some communities have continued to learn, bias of concern that can be challenging. When you ask the question, fundamentally, we need authoritative data. That at least gives the community at least a foundation, I think, for consideration of the results. One of the key things that I think should be considered along with the authoritative data is the modeling activities that go along with that. Are there good practices, processes, and community engagement in the development of those indicators, of the practices, the processes, the workflows that is publicly inspectable? And I will note, maybe going to your second question, as Angelica noted, it has to be publicly inspectable and reproducible, and it has to be available and accessible and usable by a broad community, especially if you want policies and interventions to be effective, that you have to convince them. And where you're suggesting, which I agree with you wholeheartedly, that modeling can be an amazingly powerful tool, it could take 5 years before people actually start seeing the extremes. And that's often, unfortunately, what it takes in environments, a major incident or a major activity, in order to capture people's attention. So I think that building the community's capacity and supporting their activity as a group, co-development, co-creation, co-producing, and so forth, to help create an environment of trust, I think is critical. I see that one of our colleagues, Rachel, has joined the call. And one of the things I know, Rachel, that we've been discussing related to the health of soil, as an example, because you brought up plastics and so forth, how the health of soil. And I know that USGS and other communities are doing significant research associated with plastics entering our water systems, and then how that is affecting soil and so forth. But because it's something that's unseen, like you said earlier, Ajay, because you can't see the plastic, it's hard for perhaps a community to accept that that's really an impact. But that's where having that transdisciplinary participation, like in this case, looking at food security and agriculture production, reducing in some areas and so forth, where plastic can be correlated, those types of things I think are really important to give more of a whole systems understanding to help the community move more towards acceptance, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. All right. So, and I do want to thank you for recognizing Rachel. Rachel Opitz with the Taylor Geospatial Institute has joined the call. Welcome to the webinar, Rachel. As well as Sina Tagovich. I hope I nailed that. Sina is with the Open Geospatial Consortium, is on the webinar as well. Everyone, feel free to jump in. I would like to on the core point, Rich, you mentioned that yes, when you're modeling, there's a lot of different ways to age it, and there may be some questions. Antonio, how do you generally respond to that, right? When we're taking authoritative data and aging it, we're making it synthetic. Yes, you could do a whole lot of things, make a whole lot of assumptions, right? How do you respond to Rich's concern, and I'm sure many people share the concern that once aged, the authoritative data may no longer be authoritative, or how do we ensure that it remains the best and most accurate data to use for analysis? What's the response to that?
Right. Well, first we have to agree that there is no authoritative data of the future. No one has a crystal ball of what the future is going to look like. However, if we base all of our models in existing authoritative data of current status and the past, then we can create the right correlations and the right coefficients that can be validated transparently. They can be processed by explainable models that everyone can understand, so that there can be a way to have a validation process from the moment that we take our source data from authoritative sources in order to create the models until we produce the outputs into the future, and we say, okay, this possible future that we are forecasting in the environment that we are configuring here, it's realistic because it follows the right dimensionality and the right correlation between variables that we know of from the real data from authoritative sources. But then in the end, you will only know what happens in the future when the future comes, and then you can compare with reality, and then you can do an iterative correction of your model so that future forecasts can take into account those corrections that have data elements that were not present in the initial authoritative data that you use. So data can be improving with time, but there has to be a way always with a human in the loop to check that the dimensionality and the correlations of the data, the distribution, of the data that you are generating are realistic according to the validation parameters.
So Antonio mentioned the pilot. Yeah, Skymantics and HSR.health are working on piloting the use of synthetic data and these algorithms and these solutions. So we do hope that in the near term, I'm not going to say necessarily tomorrow or by Thanksgiving maybe, but Angelica, hopefully in the near term, we will be able to provide you with some information. Well, not some information. Let me say it like this. We'll be able to identify, based on synthetic data, which is open for your investigation and interrogation, what the health risks from plastic contamination in oceans could be. Well, obviously, we started with the Canadian Arctic, and we will expand from the Canadian Arctic. And you can then let us know at your convenience, Rich, Ryan, you as well, both of you as well, if you think this future positioning of health risks is valuable to you. And if it is, then we can work on, yes, addressing the cost structure, but obviously we have to deal with that, but we can work on expanding that globally as well.
Yeah, I started my talk today, or this conversation, highlighting the importance that countries were already with some policy implemented, and what I think is that at that moment when they did the implementation of all these policies, and still I don't think that they were the reason was primarily because for example for the Caribbean countries, but the reason is definitely tourism, because tourism is the base of a great deal of income to the country. So it was problematic for them to have the tourists come into the beaches and everything full of plastic. So that probably was the primary driver for them to start working into banning plastics or some kind of policy. I think that as time has passed and now we actually are learning way more about how the plastic actually disintegrates and it goes into the fish, and later on we are eating that. I think that the information is becoming more critical as to what are the real consequences. It's not just tourism, it's health. And so definitely I think that what HSR is doing is fantastic. It's moving us in the right direction, not only to scientists, but actually to the decision makers, because it's not now about economic input. It's about health, real health issues. And so it's really beneficial to all the work that you are actually doing.
And it's synergistic, right? Because as you mentioned, the economic issues around tourism, there's actually a NOAA study you probably know about that looked at, not even in the Caribbean, just in the United States, the impact of pollution on beaches impacting current year tourism, right? That if I think the study was something along the lines that if you could cut pollution on beaches in half, what would be the economic gain from that, both in terms of tourism dollars and jobs to serve, the populations that go to the beaches? And if you double the pollution, what would be the economic losses from that? And the spread is just absolutely enormous, right? In terms of tens of thousands of jobs different between whether pollution could be cut or pollution would expand. So that kind of an economic analysis, when we can pair that with health analysis today and into the future, could be very powerful arguments. But so I do want to turn to Rachel, and then Sina, I'll introduce you as well, to come in and talk about your thoughts. And there's one of the things Rich mentioned, as we've talked about, when we see that plastic contamination in oceans, it also hits the rain, and the rainfall, of course, falls everywhere, including agricultural fields. And it does potentially damage the soil or reduce the fertility rates of soil, which increases, of course, food insecurity. And you're working in this area now, Rachel, so wanted to welcome you to the webinar and see if you had any thoughts on that you'd like to share.
Yeah, thanks, Ajay. And it's really great to hear you thinking about it in this way, because I think one of the things that this webinar really highlights for me is how interconnected these different systems are. So between environment and health, as you're pointing out, and then between ocean and land systems. And so I think my overarching thought would be that as we are designing simulations and as we are modeling, it's going to be important that we think carefully about the design of those models, and on the one hand, scope them appropriately so that they're manageable. And I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about what variables to include, what data layers to include when we're thinking about doing this work, but also being careful when we describe explaining why a connection might be left out and then what the implications of that are. So you might very reasonably do modeling of the impacts of ocean plastics without bringing in links to soil health and processes that are taking place in agricultural land. But I think it's important that we start highlighting that those connections are there. You might need a separate study to model something like that. So to model kind of the whole evapotranspiration system and understand what the impacts are, how much plastic is moving, how far it's moving. So there are, in my old life, studies, for instance, about different size pollen spores and how far they transport in wind and in water. And you can envisage something similar for microplastics in terms of their size and stickiness and kind of distance of transport under different conditions. So I think there's work to be done and research to be done, but I also think there's an interesting point here about how we scope models in these really complex systems.
It's great to hear you talk about work and research that needs to be done, Rachel, considering that you're now a funder. But I also wanted to bring in Sina to that point of the conversation, because to some extent, the OGC is also a funding type of organization. Maybe it's refunding funds that are received from sponsors, but is this sort of what you thought might happen, Sina, when Paul initially presented the idea in FMSDI of tracking plastics in oceans and assessing their health implications? Welcome to the webinar, and just want to bring you in with that question.
Thank you, Ajay. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So when we started the idea of the federated marine SDI, the idea was that some of these problems are actually, you have to look at them as some sort of a federated approach. The oceans actually are like the plastic actually moves around in the between basically intergovernmental jurisdictions. So it's not gonna stick around in a certain place where it produced necessarily. So it will move around, and that challenge by itself was the initial focus. But we actually when I think about the oceans and the plastics, it reminds me of the days when I was a kid and I used to hide everything under the rug whenever I needed to clean up the room. So it is basically the same thing. We are doing this for a long time, and at some point it's going to be an obvious problem. And as Angelica already highlighted, the Caribbean countries, the reason they're actually maybe they're putting some effort on reducing this effect is actually the tourism. That is the obvious reason for this. But regarding the implication of the modeling, that is by itself a big challenge. I just want to highlight that in so many cases, for example, the hurricane tracking, we do not have authoritative data. Like, yeah, it's as Antonio mentioned, nobody has a crystal ball. So we have the European model, and if you look at the news, they have the American model, and it's always it's not that that those models are completely irrelevant. Like the predictions is actually very important. The matter is that how important they are. So if we can highlight the effects of the ocean plastic on health to the public, basically, and highlight the reasons that this might really affect their daily life or the future very soon, then these models can have another layer of importance. So they not necessarily need to be authoritative to be of importance, at least in my opinion. And in OGC, I think we should continue to try to get to the bottom of these type of models, to try to basically make them more and closer to the reality. At least that is my opinion on this matter.
So hopefully OGC and to an extent Taylor will work on models that can expand the capacity of tracking plastics in oceans to the rest of the world, and work on synthetic modeling practices so that the future view can be effective, can be an effective future view. As you said, we already use future data for hurricanes, even though it's not authoritative. Maybe we can also learn to have a level of confidence on future health risk data. And speaking of the future, Paul, can you tell us sort of where Poseidon is going from its origination in the Canadian Arctic?
Yeah, sure thing. One sec. Let me share my screen again. All right, good. So where we are going is we are expanding, as we mentioned at the beginning, Poseidon from the use case we started off with at the Fox River Basin to expanding the analysis globally. And as a part of that, we are currently developing a spatio-temporal asset catalog, as shown here, for the initial raster interface for the plastic detection part of Poseidon. Some challenges we have noticed within that we are still working on is the further refinement of defining kind of the land and water interface as from the satellite imagery, as can be kind of demonstrated here. It's especially challenging in places like the Arctic, just due to the sheer amount of ice, and so that can lead to challenges there. From there, we are wanting to integrate Poseidon into our Anna AI orchestrator and generative AI front-end platform, and the data and indicators that comprise Poseidon when they're accessible through this interface, will enable broader audiences to gain insights from Poseidon via accessible, actionable information presented through natural language, intuitive maps, charts, graphs, and tables, essentially all the formats that best meet the user's needs. Additionally, in
Yes.
terms, sorry, go ahead, Jay.
So just essentially what that means is that instead of interrogating and learning about plastic risks through a geospatial interface, people can use a query conversational interface, very much like OpenAI's ChatGPT. And you can ask a question and get an answer. And in that regard, I actually think that probably the most common use will be the tourism use. I do think that if we have a mechanism today, or if we're able to expand Poseidon globally today, that almost everyone will ask the question, how much plastic pollution or how much pollution is on the beach that I like to go to every summer? I think that is something that everyone is interested in for their own personal vacations, their own personal time. And that's probably something that will derive a great deal of use out of Poseidon.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Paul, for that. That's very exciting. And I also really enjoy seeing that satellite imagery, right? Those thumbnails that you showed. I mean, I don't know if you can quickly bring those back up,
Of
but
course.
they are processed or feature extracted images from Sentinel-2 satellite imagery. It looks almost artistic to me, right? They almost pass for modern art. I'd like to share these images themselves with art friends. And those of you who know me know I very much like art, mainly paintings. But this could be the next craze in the art world, right? Process satellite imagery of our own planet.
That would be very interesting. I would definitely buy a piece of art like that, and I agree. They look very beautiful and definitely have a unique flavor to them.
Yeah. But let's get back to maybe what you might consider the elephant in the room, and I'm glad that Angelica brought it up, right? Because at the end of the day, these solutions are not inexpensive, right? Processing satellite imagery for the globe, extracting those, running algorithms, synthesizing data for a 5-10 year window to assess and then make available globally through a platform of some kind what the health risks are, what the plastic presence are, is an expensive proposition, right? So it does have to be something that someone is paying for. Now, we got started with seed money, essentially. You can call it seed money. It's initial grants from both NOAA and NRCan through an OGC effort. And we are exceptionally grateful for that because it has allowed us to demonstrate and put into practice a real solution to one of the world's modern day problems. I think going forward, we will need, of course, everyone recognizes that there's going to be some value in this. So this will need some funding. One of the things we've done is started a philanthropic giving campaign that, Paul, if you could share it, yeah, and post it to the link. It's actually, if you scroll down just a bit, we have estimated how much to run Poseidon over the entire planet for the course of a year would be. And our estimate came to about $475,000, of which I am really delighted to announce that we've already raised 51% of that, $244,525. Yes, thank you, Antonio. I know Antonio has made a contribution towards this goal. And so this is definitely, I think, one way, Angelica, that we're trying to raise the money. Our goal is that if we are able to raise all of it, then we can expand Poseidon globally and make that data and insights available for free to the world, right? And obviously that is a thing that we'd want to continue, but we're optimistic. We're optimistic that if all of mankind recognizes that plastic is a problem, that raising the philanthropic funds to make that data and insights available so that we can make decisions and take actions to limit exposure and to maybe even change some of our practices around the use and just incorporation of plastic in our daily lives, may be able to truly help advance economic and health issues into the future.
So Ajay, just maybe a good point, and it's good to hear that there is some investment to continue to move this work forward. Very exciting. Just wanted to point out to you, and I know I also pointed out to Rachel, there are some really exciting grants that are out there that I definitely think you should consider. And I think to the point earlier of transdisciplinary kind of connections and things like that to interrelate these capabilities with other areas so that the community at large can better understand the challenges, how it's affecting other systems. Like as was mentioned earlier with the tourism, of course, with agriculture, there are energy related impacts as plastic, the water that's being used in our rivers and streams potentially to support energy production and hydraulic systems of if plastic gets into those and the impacts they may have on those systems and other resources. If that is an opportunity to engage a broader community, I think that could be a very exciting opportunity, especially from the NSF under the Geosciences Directorate, some of the work that I know that they're very interested in.
Thank you, Rich. That's very helpful, and Rachel for sharing this information as well. We have just a few minutes left. Any last words? Ryan, any last thoughts from NRCan's perspective you'd like to share?
Sure. I can just maybe provide some commentary on the on the value that I would see of this approach being delivered on a global level, at least from Canada's perspective. Certainly the application in the Arctic is is a very good one as a starting point, given that Canada does have populations in the Arctic. It's fairly limited numbers of people, but these are locations that are extremely remote. So it is necessary to have remote monitoring solutions like satellite imagery that can inform what's going on in the environment. Particularly from a health perspective. These are communities that are not fully dependent, but have a lot of dependency on food from the land, from the local area. It is extremely expensive to ship food into the Arctic. So understanding what those challenges or what the characteristics of plastic pollution are in those areas, and what the potential future health impacts are, could be extremely valuable for, monitoring efforts and determining how to deliver, various solutions to help those communities in the Arctic. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to finish by saying, and potentially preventing, various health impacts as, healthcare delivery in the Arctic is astronomically expensive. So there's a lot of potential, I think, from this to support those types of efforts.
Yeah. I was going to add to that, although I think you covered it, you touched on it, that these are remote populations. They're also indigenous populations, right? So actually starting in the Canadian Arctic is very helpful because it allows us to anticipate the issues that indigenous local communities globally will face, right? Because to some extent they will have a lot of similarities, difficult to get supplies and resources, food and medical supplies to those resources. They are more self-sufficient than your typical global city might be. And so we do need to ensure a different level sort of resource allocation to protect and make sure those vulnerable communities are safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yep.
Okay. Well, we are nearing the end of the hour. I want to thank all of our expert speakers for joining us. Rich, Sina, Rachel, Angelica, Antonio, Paul. And thank you for your support and the efforts to help make this first webinar a success. And we hope this will be part of an ongoing series that we talk about the technology, about geospatial technologies, synthetic data, artificial intelligence, which you didn't get into too much today. And not just the technologies, but how they can be deployed in the world, given all the challenges that it faces, from geopolitical challenges to realistic challenges that governments have to make as they allocate resources to different priorities, and together make a way to find some of these solutions actually help the world. And with that, we will sign off from this webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, and appreciate all the great work